in-state tuition. Those are the two things that work in kind of some of the unison. So this slide is sort of at a glance. This is the institutional data at a glance. The red dashed lines represent inflation, 51%. And make 2 points. First of all, everybody exceeded inflation in terms of their in-state tuition growth. VMI had the lowest percent change in terms of general fund per FTE. And in fact, they and VCU actually went negative over the period of time, not even in inflation-adjusted terms, in absolute. VMI also had the lowest increase in terms of in-state tuition over that period of time. Now, I'm not saying VMI is inexpensive because of that, but most of their costs, a lot of their cost comes from their auxiliary programs, and a lot of that is related to their military mission. So it's they're in a little bit of a different position. Also to point out that you have 4 institutions, and you can see them above the red line, and those institutions actually kept pace or even exceeded inflation in terms of general fund per FTE. I also want to point out here, right around the middle of the side, there's a data point that says 4 years average. That's the 20% and the 168% data point. And so when you're looking at this, if institutions were below the data point, generally speaking, their general fund growth was less than 20% over the period. Those that were, and that's so institutions like VMI, VCU, UVA, Tech. If you were above it, if your data points are above that, they exceeded 20%. And the two that topped the list, Norfolk State grew at about 116%, and UVA-wise by 83%. Now, some of this is impacted by enrollment swings. Some of our institutions have had, you get a small institution like UVA-wise, and little bits of enrollment can move either way. And Norfolk State did experience recently some drop in enrollment. Also, again, looking, so if you are to the right of the data point, that means that your average tuition, that your in-state tuition grew by more than 168%.
Mr. Chairman.
And
Douglas Sickles.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Johnny, could you show me where the data point is you're talking about? Is there a way you can point to it? I'm not sure I
okay,
understand.
so if you're, can you spot where George Mason is?
Right in the middle.
Right in the middle. If you go down a couple of dots below that, right below VSU and JMU, there's a data point for your average.
Thank you.
Okay. And so if you're to the right, you increase by more. And yes, that is William & Mary all the way out there to the right. That they just one other point here. This is through fiscal 15. So some recent actions, resets. There were some sizable increases in 2016 are not part of this. So this kind of data needs to be updated on a somewhat routine basis. But percentages can be a little bit misleading. I'm not trying to do that. So I also put this in some perspective in terms of the dollar change, the absolute dollar change. And again, this is nominal dollars, so it's not inflation adjusted. We'll get into that.
Turning on UVA, is that before or after strategic investment?
That's before. It's before the reset. The reset took place in 16 and 17. So here the red dashed lines, you see that the 4-year average is at the intersection of the two lines. The red dashed line represents the system average. We'll get into inflation here shortly. The upper left-hand quadrant, the institutions in there, these institutions that had the dollar changes in their general fund were greater than the system growth, but the dollar changes in their tuition was actually less than the system change. So for some institutions like Radford, Mary Wash, CNU, their dollar changes were actually less than the system, even though their percentage was higher. So this gives it maybe a little bit of balance as you're looking at this, because sometimes that dollar figures will look different. In the lower left, you have this here, both general fund per student and in-state tuition grew by less than the system change. And here again, so VMI clearly was in that, but JMU, which on a percentage basis exceeded that, but on a dollar basis actually trails both figures. And you'll see for some institutions, JMU's one that's had a historically low tuition on the in-state side, so dollar changes can have a significant percentage impact on some of those. And then in the lower right are institutions that had a lower than system average general fund growth, so they grew by very little. As I said, VCU actually went negative over this period of time. But their tuition increases were higher, and basically they were making up for the lost general fund with those tuition increases. And then in the upper right, institutions exceeded both general fund and the in-state. George Mason is a little bit borderline. They kind of straddle that in-state line. As you can see, they're right there on the border. So again, the next slide comes again straight from the retreat. This is the slide that did it in constant dollars. So we take inflation sort of, we try to account for that. And again, if you recall, the notion here is that the tuition grew by $2 for every $1 lost in general fund. The tuition grew by roughly $3,200, while general fund decreased by roughly $1,600 in constant dollar terms. So how do the institutions line up with regards to this? And try doing several different slides, but at the end of the day, a tape was all that I really could come up with to kind of put it in some of the perspective. As you can see, with the 4 exceptions, all institutions lost general fund on a constant dollar basis from 96 to 15. So varying amounts, but you can see UVA, $4,100 change. VCU, almost $3,600. VMI, almost $4,100. And so, you know, there was some significant hits that had taken place there. And then you see the institutions and then you see the various tuition increases. And the third column is what I want you to focus on. That 2-to-1 ratio, this gives you a sense of the ratio for all the other institutions. And I've kind of grouped them into maybe a few groups, the modest, if you will, for lack of a better term. It's like less than a 2. So VMI, UVA, VCU, and Virginia State, their tuition offset seems to be more linked to their lost general fund. They're relatively close. It's an average group, so more than 2, less than 3. That's what I'm kind of putting in there. And that's Tech and JMU. They did go above that 2-to-1 ratio, but only slightly more. In sort of the 3 to 5 range, Old Dominion kind of sits by themselves there. Again, this may be more reflective of a couple of things. One, historically they've had low general fund support, and 2, they've had low in-state tuition, and so some of these changes, when you're starting off at a low point, might be magnified by kind of moving forward. And then maybe the last one is probably the more aggressive group, and in that group would be all those institutions where they actually grew in terms of general fund relative to inflation, but their tuition still went up, in some cases somewhat significantly. So, and again, Radford's in that group, but they also have had a historically low tuition over time. So some further analysis in terms of spending, which we talked about earlier, will probably be one of the next steps that we'll have to do. The next thing that we did during the retreat was, we had a couple of recommendations on cost containment. And there were 2 points I think I had made then. One, that to get a better understanding of what it actually costs an institution to deliver undergraduate programs is necessary before you start directing or redirecting dollars. And 2, to get the Op 6 group. This is that group that Robert, Betsy, Secretary Brown, Secretary Trent, Peter Blake, Dan Timberlake. That's the 6, the head of DPV. That they try to get a handle and establish some baselines for each of the institutions. I had started a little over a year ago at the chairman's request. I asked institutions to tell us, from your perspective, what does it cost you to deliver undergraduate and graduate programs? And parallel to that, I was doing a similar analysis to kind of try to triangulate using our funding model. So the next slide is going to serve perhaps as a starting point for the Op 6 group when they move forward. The The red data points reflect the institutional survey. This is self-reported. This is what each of these institutions, this first slide, are the research institutions. This is what each of them say that it costs them to deliver a year's worth of undergraduate education. It's not in-state, out-of-state, it's just what it costs them, not what they charge, what it costs them. The blue data point is the work comes out of the funding model and the guidelines. I've shown this as a range because I think probably the best result may lie someplace in between. Generally speaking, institutions may have understated their graduate costs. In some cases, the graduate costs and the undergraduate costs were identical that they reported, the way that the math would have worked out. And intuitively, we would assume that graduate programs would cost somewhere 1.5 times, maybe even 2 times that of the undergraduate. You think about an undergraduate class might have 30, 40 kids in it. Graduate program class might have only 10. Same professor might be teaching both, but obviously it's a little more expensive for that to teach just the 10. I will give some kudos. UVA and William & Mary did a really good job on their analysis. I think that their numbers may be actually closer to where they report them. But I think for all the other institutions, we need, this is where Op6 will need to take a closer look. Looking at the comprehensive institutions, again, because they're...
Sorry, Tony, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Do again the blue and the red.
Blue comes out of using the funding model guidelines and kind of using and deconstructing that and coming up with a per unit cost for undergraduate education. Red was each institution coming back using methodology their own. Nothing there was nothing told them how to do it on their own, coming back and saying, here's what it costs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The comprehensives are a little bit less complex. When you think of research institutions, you have a lot of things going on there, a lot of graduate programs, professional programs, things like that. Comprehensive institutions, some have graduate programs, some don't. So you see that the ranges tend to be tighter. There are some of the broader ranges. If you look at the institutions who have the broader ranges, they tend to be some of the more of the niche institutions. VMI, WISE is somewhat unique. Norfolk State, VSU, these are all unique institutions, and some of that uniqueness plays a role in the costing. So our model may not have done necessarily justice to all that. So, great slide, Tony. Where do we go with this? And I think hopefully it'll serve as a starting point when we evaluate funding or the tuition. One of the things that you hear often is, I can't take any more students because in-state students cost me money. I lose money on in-state students. And I can tell you that, again, I didn't put the number up there because it's not precise yet, and I don't want to put anything out there that at this point that serves that. But if you did a median, just look at this and just kind of even use the high range. Some institutions, when you take into account what they charge for their in-state students and the general fund subsidy, are getting over 100% cost of education for those students. Now, the out-of-state students, they're getting 200 to 300%. So undergraduate programs don't cost money. Undergraduate programs make money. They're a cash cow. The real question now is, where are those, for lack of a better term, profits going? I've had conversations, and I'd argue that a lot of it probably goes to subsidize graduate programs. You look at some institutions, graduate programs don't necessarily pay for themselves. They are more expensive. In some cases, the charge for a graduate student is actually less than the undergraduate student. I'm not saying that that's not necessary. Maybe that subsidization is required, but at least it should be part of the conversation when those tuition increases go up, that it's not, the state made me do it. It's, I have an operation, and this is the way I have to fund my operation. It also, at least we'll have some conversation then about if they are underfunded or are under-capitalizing, if you will, their graduate program, maybe part of the conversation needs to be, why can't you charge more? So it's that part of it, because if we're going to have conversations about student debt and the fact that undergraduates cost too much, it has to be more kind of of a holistic conversation in looking at all the factors.
Mr. Chairman, may I ask Tony a question?
I was gonna ask you.
Tony, so on this slide, these are the non-research institutions, and the prior slide was the research institutions,
Yes,
correct?
yes.
Talking about, and I get your definition of profit here, are you telling me that the in-state tuitions in every case on the research and the non-research institutions is above the red number?
No, no. What I'm saying to you is, it's gonna vary how close that they are. In some cases, it is above the red number. Not at every institution. Again, I did mine using a midpoint just for trying to just make it not one end or the other end, but just picking a midpoint. And 2, 4, 5, 8, 9 of the 15 institutions, the in-state percentage is above 100%. Of the remaining, one is at in-state
Tuition.
in-state students. And so in-state tuition plus general fund per FTE is greater than the cost,
Then the midpoint of your line.
than the midpoint.
9 out of 15.
9 out of 15. Of the remaining ones, one is at 98, 2 are around 93, and now there are a couple of low ones. Now, when you take into account, though, out-of-state students, so bring the out-of-state students into it, weight that between in-state and out-of-state and how much revenue gets in, every institution with 3 exceptions, and the 3 exceptions are all around 99%, are all above 100%. So with out-of-state students, every program is either at break even or well above it. Some at around 175%. So 75%, I mean, again, if you assume that it costs that, and you're generating revenues that provide 175% of your cost, that 75% is going someplace. It's being used for something. And it could, and again, I'm not saying that those things aren't valid, but it definitely is not related to general fund or whatever. It's related to some other factors.
Attorney, you named, obviously, maybe subsidizing graduate programs is one. Remind us what some of maybe the others are.
Other factors, one could be financial aid. One could also be, years ago, we used to recover the indirect cost charges for research that was done in E&G. When you do research, E&G, there's a cost to E&G. You're using space, you're using utilities, water, whatever it is. Most of it is plant costs. We don't do that anymore. Back in the early 2000s, one of the asks and the gives was to no longer, that the institution gets to keep 100% of that. We used to keep, I want to say it was 40% or something, there was some flat number, and the institution kept 60%. Now they keep 100%. Research has grown, and those costs theoretically have gone up. Those costs have gone up. If you remember one of the slides, plant costs are one of the big drivers of what's spending. That has to be paid by somebody, and could be it's a combination of state and student. That's why I say something, a deeper look into some of these things, spending whatever, is what's going to be necessary next. And the Op6 group and bringing an array of individuals will probably be better equipped to do some of that. Lastly, the proposed cuts. I wanted to walk you through these real quick and get some feedback from you. The first column here is the proposed general fund cut. It was calculated 5% against the general fund base. So institutions are going to be impacted differently when you look at the total, the percent of total E&G, which is what they operate off of. Again, as you could see, William & Mary and UVA, arguably 2 institutions with the most resources and the most potential non-general fund revenue ability, only experience about a 1% impact. Then you look, now compare that to Old Dominion, Wise, Longwood, CNU, and now 2-year colleges. They have higher in-state enrollments, and their impacts are 2% or greater. And when you look at that potential non-general fund offset column, as you can see, some institutions can offset that with 1.5% fairly modest increase in non-general fund revenue. Wise would have to generate almost 10% new revenue, and that comes on about a 95–96% in-state student base in order to make up for that reduction. So, you know, I have the points on the next slide, but I'll just kind of walk through them. You know, basically, is it fair, is it reasonable that general fund across the board be used if it doesn't take into account the non-general fund impact and the potential impact on in-state students? And since this is your budget, should I, as putting together recommendations for you, factor revenue generating ability into the equation when figuring out what the distribution would be? Should you exempt, there are two institutions that are exempt, actually, when you look at the overall thing, there's some exemptions on the extension side. Should there be exemptions? Or should we have perhaps some tiering of how the reductions get done? You know, everybody takes some reduction, but perhaps smaller set of reductions for some institutions versus others. How do you want to treat VIMS and extension? They have no general fund ability, no non-general fund ability. So, you know, do we give them? Do we try to give them some exemption? And when looking at that, is the assumption going to be that the size of the reduction is the same? It's just a distribution. So someone gets a zero, someone gets a little bit more. Or is it that the overall reduction, if that's possible, gets changed? And then lastly, should the impact on in-state students, in-state undergraduate students, be consistent across the system? Whether you're going to Radford or Old Dominion, George Mason, your community colleges, whatever it is, your impact on a percentage basis is proportionally the same regardless of where you go from this reduction. And should in-state students perhaps be sheltered somewhat relative to other student groups? The last piece is targeted reductions. Do you want to look at or revisit some of your 2016 spending decisions, given the fact that that money wasn't really there? Would you have made those same decisions and factor that into doing some of these reductions before kind of moving forward? So that basically, I talked through all those points. That basically is the presentation, Mr. Chairman. I'm happy to answer any more questions.
Okay, if you're looking for a little input, especially if you go back to observations on government proposed higher education budget reductions, some of those points that you made, you know, didn't have to be today, but you're looking at some input
Right,
from the
just
committee on what their feelings about
yes, sir.
that, whether it applies to the existing institutions or, you know, do we treat, you know, certain ones differently, et cetera. So if you want to have any comments on that, I mean, certainly if you don't have them today, I would say that, you know, attorney's looking for sort of what your feelings are. But does anybody have any input they'd like to throw out there today? Very good presentation. I think it's very thoughtful and gives us some things to work with. Jimmy?
Tony, how hard would it be, I mean, this is really good data. I mean, I would like to know, it would be interesting, a data point for us to know what the market is saying about our price increases. You know, so I'm always interested in what Mr. Market is saying, especially when it is composed of tens of thousands. In this case, it's going to be composed of tens of thousands of Virginians and maybe not, and probably tens of thousands of non-Virginians as well. Is there any way to get quickly just data point on what applications have done at these institutions over the same time period? I think that's a really, would be just a data point for us to see what the market is saying.
I'm pretty sure Chev has, I'm pretty sure Chev has that data.
Yeah,
And
is the market
I
throwing
can-
up all over these things, or is it saying, give me more of it? It's, you know, I mean, just, it's just a nice data point.
Sure, absolutely.
For the others? Great. Tony, thank you for the thoughtful presentation. I think that's all we have today.
Yes, sir.
The subcommittee stands adjourned.